The gunshots cracked through the evening air like thunder. 3 rapid bursts that shattered the peaceful suburban tranquility. Alicia Martinez Johnson dropped her watering can, the ceramic vessel exploding against the concrete as she spun toward the sound. Her husband Marcus was sprawled across their driveway, crimson spreading beneath his navy polo shirt, his car keys glinting in the dying sunlight just inches from his outstretched fingers. 2 officers stood 15 feet away, weapons still drawn, their faces masks of confusion and panic. The taller one, badge reading Henderson, was already reaching for his radio. His partner, a younger man whose hands trembled visibly, kept his gun trained on Marcus's motionless form. "Shots fired. Suspect down." Henderson barked into his radio, his voice carrying across the quiet neighborhood where porch lights were beginning to flicker on. "Need paramedics at 1247 Maple Grove immediately." Alicia's combat instincts kicked in before her civilian mind could process what had happened. She moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent 12 years in the most elite military units, her sneakers silent against the pavement as she approached the scene. The officers didn't notice her immediately, too focused on their radio chatter and the man bleeding on the asphalt. Marcus. The name tore from her throat as she dropped to her knees beside her husband, her hands automatically moving to assess his wounds. 3 entry points: center mass, professional grouping. Her medical training from Delta Force field operations took over as she applied pressure to the worst bleeding, her white gardening shirt quickly soaking with blood. "Ma'am, step back." The younger officer's voice cracked as he finally noticed her. "This is a crime scene." She looked up at him with eyes that had seen combat in 3 different countries, her voice deadly calm. "Crime scene. This is my husband in my driveway. What crime exactly are you talking about?" "Officer." She read his nameplate. "Officer Bradley." Henderson was approaching now, holstering his weapon but keeping his hand near it. "Ma'am, we received a report of an armed robbery suspect in this area. Your husband matched the description and appeared to be reaching for a weapon when we ordered him to stop." "Reaching for a weapon?" Alicia's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. She held up Marcus's car keys, now slick with blood. "You mean his house keys? The ones he was using to unlock the door of his own home?" The sound of sirens was growing closer, but not fast enough. Marcus's breathing was shallow, his pulse weak under her fingers. She had seen too many good soldiers die from treatable wounds because help arrived too late. Not here, not her husband, not in their own driveway. "Where's your medical kit?" she demanded, looking between the 2 officers. "Your department issues basic first aid supplies. Where are they?" Henderson and Bradley exchanged glances. "Ma'am, paramedics are en route. You need to step back and let us secure the scene." "Secure the scene!" Alicia's voice rose now, years of command authority bleeding through. "My husband is bleeding out on our driveway because you 2 couldn't tell the difference between a robbery suspect and a software engineer coming home from work. The only thing that needs securing is medical attention for the man you just shot." Mrs. Chen from next door had appeared at her fence, phone in hand, recording everything. Other neighbors were emerging from their homes, drawn by the sirens and the commotion. The streetlights had come on automatically, casting harsh shadows across the scene that would be replayed on news channels within hours. The paramedics arrived in a blaze of flashing lights and organized chaos. Alicia stepped back only far enough to let them work. But she didn't leave Marcus's side. She rattled off his vitals and the nature of his wounds with medical precision that made the lead paramedic look up at her sharply. "You medical?" he asked, as his team worked to stabilize Marcus. "Former military," she replied tersely. 12 years. Medical cross-training. He's lost approximately 30% blood volume. Probable liver damage from the trajectory of the second wound. He needs surgery within the next 15 minutes, or you're going to lose him." The paramedic nodded grimly and barked orders to his team. Within minutes, they had Marcus on a gurney and were loading him into the ambulance. Alicia climbed in beside them without asking permission. As the ambulance pulled away, Henderson was already on his radio with his supervisor. The dashboard camera footage would need to be reviewed. Statements would need to be taken. The shooting would need to be justified in reports that would be filed within hours. But the real reckoning was just beginning. St. Mary's Hospital had seen its share of trauma cases, but the arrival of Marcus Johnson brought an unusual tension to the emergency department. Word had already spread through the police scanner traffic that this was an officer-involved shooting, and hospital security was trying to manage the growing crowd of reporters gathering in the parking lot. Alicia sat in the surgical waiting area, her blood-stained clothes drawing stares from other visitors. She had refused offers of clean scrubs, partly because she needed to think, and partly because she wanted everyone to see exactly what Henderson and Bradley's split-second decision had cost. Dr. Sarah Kim, the trauma surgeon, emerged from the operating room after 4 hours that felt like 4 years. Her scrubs were stained, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Johnson, your husband is stable. We were able to repair the liver damage and remove 2 of the bullets. The third one is lodged near his spine. But we've stopped the bleeding. He's unconscious, but breathing on his own." Alicia felt the tension she'd been carrying in her shoulders finally release slightly. "When can I see him?" "He's being moved to ICU now. Give us another hour to get him settled." "Doctor..." Kim studied Alicia's face carefully. "The police have been asking when they can take his statement. I told them that won't be possible for at least 48 hours, assuming he regains consciousness without complications." "Thank you." Alicia's voice was hoarse from hours of contained emotion. "Doctor, I need you to know that my husband is a completely innocent man. He was coming home from work when this happened. There was no crime, no weapon, no threat." "Doctor..." Kim nodded slowly. "I've been doing trauma surgery for 15 years. Mrs. Johnson, I've seen a lot of police shootings. This one..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The wound patterns suggest your husband was facing away when he was shot. That's not typically consistent with someone posing an immediate threat." Those words would matter more than Dr. Kim realized. Within 6 hours, her medical assessment would be part of a report that would change everything. The next morning brought a media circus that descended on Maple Grove like a plague of locusts. News vans lined the street, reporters knocked on doors, and helicopters circled overhead, capturing aerial footage of the driveway where Marcus had been shot. Alicia had returned home only to shower and change clothes before heading back to the hospital. She emerged from her front door to find a crowd of reporters waiting on her lawn. "Mrs. Johnson, can you tell us what happened yesterday evening? Do you plan to file a lawsuit against the police department? Is it true your husband has no criminal record?" She paused on her front steps, studying the crowd of cameras and microphones. For 12 years, she had operated in shadows, completing missions that would never appear in any public record. Now she stood in the harsh glare of national attention, and every word she spoke would matter. "My name is Alicia Martinez Johnson," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Yesterday evening at approximately 6:30, my husband Marcus Johnson was shot 3 times by police officers in our driveway. He was returning home from his job as a software engineer at Dataflow Solutions. He was unarmed. He posed no threat to anyone. He was simply trying to unlock our front door." The reporters pressed closer, sensing something in her tone that suggested this was more than just another police shooting story. The officers claimed they were responding to a robbery suspect in the area. Alicia continued, They have provided no evidence that my husband matched any actual suspect description. They have provided no evidence that he made any threatening gestures. They shot an innocent man in his own driveway. And now, they're trying to justify it with vague claims about fearing for their safety. Mrs. Johnson, called out Sandra Martinez from Channel 7 News. Sources are telling us you have an extensive military background. Can you comment on that? Alicia had been waiting for this question. She had made some calls the night before, reaching out to former colleagues who understood what was at stake here. I served 12 years in the United States Army, she said clearly. I was part of special operations units that deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. I was trained in combat medicine, tactical operations, and de-escalation techniques. I know what it looks like when someone is actually threatening. I know what proper threat assessment looks like. And I know that what happened to my husband yesterday was not proper police procedure. The crowd erupted with follow-up questions. But Alicia was already walking to her car. She had said what needed to be said. Now the internet would do the rest. By noon, social media was exploding with hashtags like Your Justice for Marcus and Yarji Delta Force Wife. Someone had done a deep dive into Alicia's military records and discovered that she wasn't just any veteran. She was Sergeant First Class Alicia Martinez, recipient of 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. A medic who had saved 17 lives during a Taliban ambush in Kandahar province. The story was no longer about just another police shooting. It was about a decorated war hero watching her husband get gunned down in his own driveway by officers who couldn't tell the difference between a threat and a man coming home from work. Captain Robert Hayes of the Metro Police Department called an emergency press conference for 2 o'clock that afternoon. He had been hoping the story would die down over the weekend, but the revelation of Alicia's military background had turned this into a national news event. The Metro Police Department takes all officer-involved shootings seriously, he began, reading from prepared remarks. Officers Henderson and Bradley were responding to a reported armed robbery in the area when they encountered an individual who matched the suspect description. When ordered to stop and show his hands, the individual appeared to reach for what officers believed could be a weapon. Reporter Sandra Martinez raised her hand. Captain Hayes, what was the exact description of the robbery suspect? We've been unable to confirm that any robbery actually took place yesterday evening. Hayes consulted his notes, suddenly looking uncomfortable. The suspect was described as a black male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothing. That's it, Martinez pressed. That description could fit thousands of men in this city. Marcus Johnson is 5'9" and was wearing a navy polo shirt. How exactly did he match that description? The investigation is ongoing. Hayes replied tersely. We'll have more information as it becomes available. But the damage was already done. Within an hour, enterprising reporters had confirmed that no robbery had been reported in the Maple Grove area yesterday evening. The armed robbery suspect that Henderson and Bradley were supposedly looking for didn't exist. The afternoon brought a development that would change everything. Alicia was sitting beside Marcus's hospital bed, watching his chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of the ventilator. When her phone rang, the caller ID showed a number she hadn't seen in 3 years. Martinez. Her voice was tired, but alert. Alicia, it's Colonel Patterson from Pentagon Public Affairs. I'm sorry to hear about Marcus. How is he? Stable but critical. They don't know if there will be permanent spinal damage. She kept her voice steady, but Patterson could hear the strain underneath. I'm calling because this story has reached some very high levels. The Secretary of Defense's office is aware of the situation. More importantly, some of your former team members have been making calls. Alicia sat up straighter. What kind of calls? The kind that get generals' attention. Martinez, you saved a lot of lives over there. You've got people in very senior positions who remember that. People who don't like seeing war heroes' families get shot down in their own driveways. What are you saying? Sir, I'm saying that if you need resources for this fight, you've got them. Legal support, expert witnesses, media coordination, whatever it takes to make sure justice gets done. After Patterson hung up, Alicia stared at her phone for a long time. She had spent 12 years in the shadows, her accomplishments classified, her service invisible to the public. Now that service was about to become very visible indeed. The next morning brought news that would shatter the police department's narrative entirely. Rebecca Chen, the neighbor who had been recording from her fence, had uploaded her footage to social media. The video was grainy, but clear enough to show Marcus walking slowly toward his front door, keys in hand, completely unaware that two police officers were approaching from behind. There was no shouted warning, no command to stop, no chance for Marcus to comply with any orders. Henderson and Bradley had simply drawn their weapons and fired. The video went viral within hours. Murder, not mistake, started trending. Protesters began gathering outside police headquarters. Marcus Johnson had become a symbol of everything wrong with police accountability in America. More importantly for Alicia, the video proved that the officer's version of events was a complete fabrication. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh called a press conference that afternoon to announce that her office would be conducting a thorough investigation into the shooting. What she didn't announce was that she had spent the morning on the phone with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. That evening, Alicia received another call that would change the trajectory of everything. Mrs. Johnson, this is Agent Sarah Foster with the FBI Civil Rights Division. I'm calling to inform you that we're opening a federal investigation into the shooting of your husband under Section 242 of Title 18, which makes it a federal crime for someone acting under color of law to willfully deprive another person of their constitutional rights. Alicia felt something she hadn't felt since the shooting Hope. What does that mean practically? It means that Officers Henderson and Bradley are now facing potential federal charges that carry up to life in prison if your husband dies, or up to 10 years if he survives. It also means that this case is being handled by prosecutors who don't have to worry about maintaining relationships with the local police department. The FBI investigation moved with remarkable speed. Within 72 hours, agents had interviewed every neighbor on the street, analyzed Henderson and Bradley's radio transmissions, and discovered that the officers had never actually received any call about a robbery suspect. They had simply seen a black man in an upscale neighborhood and decided he didn't belong there. The revelation sparked outrage that extended far beyond Maple Grove. Civil rights organizations, veterans groups, and community activists converged on the city. Alicia found herself at the center of a movement she had never wanted to join but couldn't abandon. Marcus remained unconscious, but his condition was slowly improving. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about his chances for a full recovery, though it would be a long road. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after the shooting, Alicia held her first formal press conference. She stood behind a podium outside the hospital, flanked by her lawyer and representatives from 3 veterans organizations. The crowd of reporters had grown to include national media outlets and international correspondents. 1 week ago, my husband was shot 3 times by police officers who saw a black man in his own neighborhood and decided he was a threat. She began. In the week since then, we've learned that there was no robbery report, no suspect description, and no warning given before they opened fire. We've learned that Officers Henderson and Bradley lied in their initial reports and continue to lie about what happened. She paused, making eye contact with the cameras that would carry her words across the country. But we've also learned something else. We've learned that when war veterans get shot down in their own driveways, The American people still believe in justice. We've learned that when trained soldiers who serve their country with honor are treated like criminals in their own neighborhoods, there are still people willing to stand up and demand accountability. The questions came rapidly. Mrs. Johnson, what do you want to see happen to the officers involved? I want to see them held accountable under the law, just like any other citizens who shot an innocent person. I want to see systemic changes that prevent this from happening to other families. And I want to see my husband recover, so he can help me fight for those changes. Do you think your military background has influenced how this case is being handled? Alicia considered the question carefully. I think my military background has given me resources and connections that other victims might not have. That shouldn't matter. Justice shouldn't depend on who you know or what you've done for your country. Every American should have the right to walk to their front door without being shot by police. What's your message to other police officers? My message is simple. Do your job properly. Assess actual threats, not perceived ones. Serve and protect all citizens, not just the ones you're comfortable with. And remember that the badge doesn't give you the right to be judge, jury, and executioner. The press conference made headlines around the world. War hero's husband, shot by police, became the story that finally forced a national conversation about police accountability. Behind the scenes, the legal machinery was moving inexorably toward justice. The federal grand jury convened on Monday morning in a downtown courthouse, surrounded by protesters and media. 23 citizens would review the evidence and decide whether Officers Henderson and Bradley should face federal charges. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen, presented a case that was devastatingly simple. Video evidence showed the officers approaching Marcus without cause. Audio evidence showed they never identified themselves or gave any warnings. Medical evidence showed Marcus was shot while facing away from the officers. Henderson and Bradley's defense attorneys argued that their clients had made a split-second decision in a dangerous situation. But when Chen played Rebecca Chen's video for the grand jury, showing Marcus walking peacefully to his door before being shot in the back, that argument crumbled. The grand jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning true bills against both officers. Henderson was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, resulting in bodily injury. Bradley faced the same charge, plus lying to federal investigators for his false statements about the incident. When the indictments were announced, protesters outside the courthouse erupted in cheers. For the first time in the city's history, police officers were facing federal charges for shooting an unarmed civilian. Marcus regained consciousness on Thursday afternoon, 11 days after the shooting. The first face he saw was Alicia's, and the first words he heard were her whispering, "You're safe now. You're going to be okay." The bullet near his spine had not caused permanent damage, though he would need months of physical therapy. The emotional damage would take longer to heal. "What happened?" he asked weakly. "I remember coming home from work. And then—" Alicia took his hand gently. "2 police officers shot you in our driveway. They're claiming you were a robbery suspect. But there was no robbery. They're facing federal charges now." Marcus stared at the ceiling for a long time, processing this information. Federal charges. The whole country is watching this case. Marcus, your shooting has become a symbol of everything wrong with police accountability. The FBI is investigating. The officers are facing prison time. And there are going to be major changes in how this department operates. Because of what happened to me. Because of what happened to us. And because we're not going to let them get away with it. The trial of Officers Henderson and Bradley began 3 months later in federal court. The prosecution's case was straightforward. 2 police officers had violated Marcus Johnson's constitutional rights by shooting him without justification, then lied about it afterward. Alicia attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row where the defendants could see her. She wanted them to remember whose life they had tried to destroy. The defense tried to portray Henderson and Bradley as dedicated officers who had made an honest mistake in a dangerous situation. But when Rebecca Chen's video was played for the jury, showing Marcus being shot in the back without warning, even their own attorneys seemed to realize how thin their case was. The prosecution called Dr. Sarah Kim, who testified that Marcus's wound patterns were inconsistent with someone posing a threat. They called the dispatcher, who confirmed that no robbery had been reported. They called Marcus himself, who testified quietly but powerfully about the moment his life was nearly ended for the crime of coming home from work. And then they called Alicia. She took the witness stand, wearing her dress blue uniform, her bronze stars and purple heart clearly visible. The prosecutor established her military credentials methodically: 12 years of service, multiple combat deployments, advanced training in tactical operations and medical care. Mrs. Johnson, the prosecutor asked, based on your military training and combat experience, was there any justification for Officers Henderson and Bradley to perceive your husband as a threat? None whatsoever. Alicia replied firmly, in the military, we're taught rules of engagement that require positive identification of a threat before using deadly force. We're taught to assess behavior, not just appearance. Marcus was walking slowly, peacefully, with his back to the officers. He was clearly focused on unlocking his door. There was nothing in his behavior that suggested any threat to anyone. What would have been the appropriate police response in this situation if they genuinely believed he was a suspect? The appropriate response would have been to identify themselves as police officers and ask him to stop. If they wanted to question him, they could have approached openly and asked for identification. There was no justification for drawing weapons, let alone firing them. The defense attorney tried to shake her testimony on cross-examination, suggesting that civilian police work was different from military operations. Alicia's response was devastating. You're right that police work is different from military operations, she said calmly. In military operations, we're dealing with actual enemy combatants who are actively trying to kill us. Even in those circumstances, we have strict rules about when we can use deadly force. Police officers dealing with American civilians should have even stricter standards, not more lenient ones. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Henderson was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Bradley received 8 years, plus 3 years of supervised release. But the legal victory was only the beginning of the changes that would follow. The city settled Alicia and Marcus's civil lawsuit for $4.2 million, the largest police misconduct settlement in the city's history. More importantly, the settlement required the police department to implement sweeping reforms, mandatory bias training, new use of force policies, and the creation of an independent oversight board with subpoena power. Alicia used her share of the settlement to establish the Marcus Johnson Foundation for Police Accountability, which provides legal support for victims of police misconduct and advocates for policy reforms at the state and federal level. She also accepted an appointment to the city's new Police Oversight Board, where her military background and personal experience made her a powerful voice for reform. Marcus returned to work 6 months after the shooting, but the experience had changed him profoundly. He began speaking at community meetings and police training sessions, sharing his story and advocating for better training and accountability. I was shot because 2 police officers saw a black man in a nice neighborhood and assumed I didn't belong there. He would tell audiences, that assumption nearly cost me my life. It cost my family months of trauma and uncertainty. And it cost our community its trust in the people who are supposed to protect and serve us. The changes in Maple Grove became a model for other cities grappling with similar problems. The independent oversight board that Alicia helped create became one of the most effective police accountability mechanisms in the country, with real power to investigate misconduct and discipline officers. The department's new use of force policies required officers to exhaust all alternatives before drawing weapons, and mandated immediate medical aid for anyone injured during police encounters. Officers who violated these policies faced swift discipline, including termination. 2 years after the shooting, Alicia was invited to testify before a congressional committee considering federal police reform legislation. She wore her dress uniform again, her medals catching the television lights as she addressed the representatives. "Members of Congress," she began, "I served my country for 12 years in some of the most dangerous places on earth. I never imagined that the greatest threat to my family's safety would come from the people sworn to protect us in our own neighborhood." She looked directly into the cameras, knowing that her words were being broadcast across the nation. The shooting of my husband was not an isolated incident. It was the predictable result of a system that trains police officers to see certain communities as enemy territory. It was the predictable result of a culture that values officer safety over civilian rights. And it was the predictable result of decades of insufficient accountability for police misconduct. But it was also preventable. With proper training, with clear policies, with meaningful oversight, Officers Henderson and Bradley could have done their jobs without destroying an innocent man's life. That's what we're fighting for. That's what every American deserves. The federal legislation that emerged from those hearings became known as the Marcus Johnson Police Accountability Act. It required all police departments receiving federal funding to implement use of force standards similar to those adopted in Maple Grove. It created a national database for tracking police misconduct, making it impossible for problem officers to simply move to new departments. And it established federal oversight mechanisms for departments with patterns of civil rights violations. President signed the legislation on a warm spring morning, surrounded by police reform advocates and families of victims. Alicia and Marcus stood directly behind the president as she signed each page. The pens used for the signing ceremony later distributed to the advocacy organizations that had fought for the reforms. This legislation honors the service of Sergeant First Class Alicia Martinez Johnson and the sacrifice of her family, the president said in her remarks. But more importantly, it ensures that no other American family will have to endure what the Johnsons endured. It makes our communities safer by making our police departments more accountable. Standing in the Rose Garden that day, watching the president sign legislation that bore her husband's name, Alicia reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The shooting that could have destroyed their family had instead become a catalyst for changes that would protect countless other families. Marcus squeezed her hand as they watched the ceremony. His physical recovery was complete, but the emotional scars would never fully fade. Neither of them would ever again take for granted something as simple as walking to their front door. But they had turned their trauma into purpose, their pain into progress. The gunshots that had shattered their peaceful evening had ultimately echoed across the nation, forcing a reckoning with injustice that had been ignored for too long. In the years that followed, Alicia would often speak about the dual nature of that terrible evening. It was the worst thing that had ever happened to their family, but it was also the beginning of the most important work of their lives. Justice isn't just about punishing the people who do wrong, she would tell audiences. Justice is about creating systems that prevent wrong from being done in the first place. Justice is about building communities where every family can feel safe in their own neighborhood, regardless of the color of their skin or the size of their bank account. The foundation she established continued to grow, supporting police reform efforts in dozens of cities and providing legal assistance to hundreds of families affected by police misconduct. Marcus became a frequent speaker at police academies, sharing his story with new recruits and emphasizing the human cost of poor decision-making. Together, They had transformed a moment of devastating injustice into a movement for lasting change. The shadows that had fallen over their lives that terrible evening had ultimately given way to light, not just for their family, but for communities across the nation. Their story became proof that sometimes, when the worst things happen to good people, those people can respond by making sure the worst things happen less often to everyone else. Justice, they learned, wasn't just about punishment. It was about prevention, protection, and the persistent belief that America could always become more perfect than it was.